Madison Square Garden holds 20,000 people when it's configured for boxing. The outdoor venue they used that June evening in 1973 held 70,000, and by the time Muhammad Ali walked to the center of the floor at 8:17 in the evening, every seat was full, and the standing sections at the back had absorbed another 4,000 people who had paid for the right to stand. The event was a boxing exhibition and charity gala, the kind of large-scale spectacle that only Ali could generate in 1973, which was to say the kind that drew not just boxing fans, but people who came because Ali was a phenomenon that extended beyond boxing, a figure who occupied cultural space that no athlete before him had occupied in quite the same way. Ali was 31 years old that evening. He had just returned from fighting in Zaire 8 months before, and the world was still sorting through what to make of him, which was the state the world had been in regarding Muhammad Ali since approximately 1960, and showed no signs of resolving. He was the most famous athlete on the planet, possibly the most famous person, and he carried this the way he carried everything, which was with the specific ease of someone who had decided that the appropriate response to being the most extraordinary thing in any room was simply to confirm this for everyone present. He was in excellent spirits. He had been in excellent spirits all week. He had also, 4 days before this evening, given an interview to a radio journalist named Carter Davis on Winds, New York, in which he had said something that moved through the martial arts community the way his statements generally moved through any community, which was fast and with considerable momentum. He had said Bruce Lee was afraid to fight. He had said it in the way he said everything, with rhythm and precision and the specific performance of certainty that was one of his defining qualities. He had said that Bruce Lee made movies about fighting. He had said that movies about fighting and actual fighting were separated by a distance that no amount of training could fully close without actual combat experience. He had said that a man who had never been hit hard enough to not know where he was for a moment did not know what he was made of in the way that a man who had been through that experience knew. He had said that he respected Bruce Lee as a performer and as a practitioner in his own domain. And then he had said the sentence that spread. He said, "But if Bruce Lee wants to find out what real is, he knows where to find me. And the fact that he hasn't found me yet tells you something." Carter Davis had asked what it told you. Ali had said, "It tells you he's smart enough to know the difference between what he does and what I do, and smart enough to stay on his side of it." Pause. Which is the same as afraid, just spelled different. The interview had run on Winds at 7 in the morning. By noon, it had been picked up by 3 newspapers. By the following day, it was being discussed in martial arts schools across the country in the specific way that statements about their community were discussed, with the mixture of offense and uncomfortable partial acknowledgement that comes when someone says something unfair that contains a kernel of something worth thinking about. Bruce Lee heard about it that afternoon. The afternoon of the day the interview aired. He was in Los Angeles, between projects, and a friend called and read him the transcript over the phone. He listened to all of it. He did not say anything until the reading was finished. Then he said, "Is Ali in New York this week?" His friend said yes, there was a charity event at that outdoor venue on Thursday. Bruce said, "Get me a seat." His friend said, "What kind of seat?" Bruce said, "The kind that's close to the floor." Subscribe right now, because what happens at 8:42 in that venue on Thursday evening is the thing that 70,000 people and one radio journalist tried to describe for the next 30 years and never fully managed. To understand the evening, you first have to understand Ali, as he was in June of 1973, which means understanding something that people sometimes misplace in the larger narrative of who he was. He was not wrong about the things he said. That has to be acknowledged first, because the story doesn't have the weight it has if Ali is simply wrong. He was not simply wrong. He was making a real observation, which was that the experience of being hit hard by someone trying to hurt you in front of a crowd, with real stakes attached to the outcome, produced a specific kind of knowledge about yourself that could not be replicated in a training hall or manufactured for a camera. He had been through that experience dozens of times. He knew what it produced. He was correct that it produced something. What he was wrong about was the assumption that this specific kind of knowledge was the only kind that mattered, and the assumption underneath that assumption, which was that a man who did not fight in his way, under his rules, in his context, was therefore not fighting at all. He had been the most dominant thing in every physical context he had ever entered. This had produced in him, alongside genuine greatness, a particular narrowness of imagination about what physical capability could look like when it was organized around different principles. He was not stupid. He was not dishonest. He was a man who had found the ceiling of every room he had entered, and who had therefore stopped looking carefully for the ceiling, and who had consequently missed some ceilings that were considerably higher than he had accounted for. He would encounter one of them at 8:42 on a Thursday evening in June. The evening's program had run in the order announced. 3 exhibition bouts, each one featuring Ali, in abbreviated form, enough to remind the crowd why they had come without exhausting the capacity he would need for the full card the following week. Ali in exhibition mode was still Ali, which meant he was still the most electrifying thing most of the people watching had ever seen in person. He moved between the exhibition bouts with the microphone, the way he had always moved with a microphone, with the specific rhythm of someone for whom the instrument was as natural as his hands. He talked about the fighters, about the sport, about himself, about the crowd, and the crowd gave back everything he gave with compound interest. At 8:15, he finished the 3rd exhibition and stood in the center of the floor with the microphone while the crowd was still producing its response to what it had just witnessed. He said, "You know what I was thinking about this week? I was thinking about the question of what makes a real fighter. Not an entertainer, not a performer, a real fighter." The crowd listened. He said, "I said something on the radio a few days ago about a man who makes movies about fighting. And I want to say it again here because I meant it, and I'm not going to back away from it just because some people took it wrong." He said, "Bruce Lee is a remarkable man. I respect what he does, but what he does is not this. What he does is beautiful, and beautiful and real are not always the same thing." He paused for the specific beat that he knew how to place inside a sentence. He said, "And I said on the radio that the reason we haven't found out the difference is that he's smart. Smart enough to know which side of the line he's on and stay there." He let the crowd process this. It was a large crowd. It took a moment for 70,000 people to arrive at their collective response. While they were arriving at it, something happened in the 17th row. A man stood up. He was not large. He was not dressed in any particular way. He was wearing a plain dark jacket and dark trousers, and he stood with the quality of stillness that some people carry, even when they are upright and in motion, the stillness that comes from inside, rather than being imposed on the outside. He was 5'7" and 140 pounds. He had been sitting in the 17th row since the beginning of the evening's program. He had arrived without announcement, found his seat without assistance, and sat for 2 hours watching with the quality of attention he brought to everything serious, which was the total attention of someone building a picture from what they observed. He had a single piece of paper in his jacket pocket. It was the transcript of the radio interview. He had read it 3 times on the flight from Los Angeles. He had not taken it out since he arrived. The recognition started, as it always did, with the people nearest to him, and moved outward. The 17th row. The 16th, the 18th, and then faster, as the wave moved, the specific wave of collective recognition that moved through large crowds when something worth recognizing had appeared. The crowd, which had been processing Ali's statement, was now processing something else simultaneously. Ali, in the center of the floor, saw the crowd's attention shift. He tracked it the way a man tracks anything in a room, with the automatic instincts of someone who had spent years reading audience reactions. He followed the crowd's gaze to the 17th row. He looked at the man who had stood up. He said, into the microphone, with the specific ease of someone who had been improvising in front of large audiences since his early 20s. "Well, it looks like we have a guest, like this video right now, because what happens in the next 90 seconds is something that nobody in that venue described the same way twice." Bruce Lee walked from the 17th row to the floor without hurrying. People in the rows he passed stepped aside with the automatic courtesy of recognition, and he moved through the space they created without acknowledging it, his attention already directed toward the floor, toward what he was walking toward. He reached the floor's edge. He stepped onto it. He stood at a distance of approximately 30 feet from Muhammad Ali. Ali looked at him, really looked, the specific focused look of a man who had studied opponents his entire professional life and had developed genuine expertise at reading what he was seeing. He had seen Bruce Lee's training footage. He had watched it with genuine analytical attention. He had formed real opinions about what he saw. He was now seeing something the footage had not fully conveyed, which was the specific quality of how Bruce Lee occupied space, the economy of him. The sense that nothing was happening on the surface, and that this was not because nothing was happening, but because everything was happening underneath, in the place where most people's tells lived, and finding nothing there. Ali said, into the microphone, still easy, still warm, Bruce Lee. In person, smaller than I thought, the crowd produced a sound, not hostile, the specific sound of a large group acknowledging something that had been said about size and finding it funny in the way that things are funny when they're true, and also incomplete. Bruce said, not loudly, but clearly, in the specific way he was able to project his voice without raising it, smaller than you thought, bigger than you expected. The crowd responded differently to this. The response was larger and had something more specific in it. Ali processed this. He was very good at processing exchanges in front of crowds. He had been doing it for 15 years. He said, "You hear what I said on the radio?" Bruce said, "Yes." Ali said, "You got something to say about it?" Bruce said, "I thought I'd say it here instead." Ali smiled. The full Ali smile, the one that had been on 100 magazine covers, the one that managed to contain warmth and absolute certainty simultaneously, without either canceling the other. He said, "You came all the way to New York to say something to me, in front of 70,000 people." Bruce said, "It seemed like the honest version." Ali looked at him for a moment. He said, "All right, come here." Bruce walked toward him, not quickly, not slowly. The specific pace of someone who has already decided something and is implementing the decision. They stood 5 feet apart in the center of the floor. Ali was 6'3", Bruce was 5'7". Ali was 220 pounds, Bruce was 140 pounds. The visual arithmetic was obvious, and the crowd was doing it. Ali said, now not into the microphone, but audible to the people near the floor, "You know I could pick you up and put you somewhere." Bruce said, "You could try." Ali's eyes changed slightly. Not the smile, the eyes. Something behind them recalibrated in a way that happened fast enough that most of the crowd didn't catch it. He said, "That's not respectful." Bruce said, "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." Ali looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was rarely quiet in front of crowds, the quiet of genuine processing rather than strategic pause. He said, "You want to show me something?" Bruce said, "You said something that wasn't accurate. I'd like to address it." Ali said, "On what terms?" Bruce said, "Your terms. You pick." This was the sentence that the people close enough to hear it would think about afterward. You pick. Not a negotiation, not a counterproposal, a genuine offer of complete deference on the terms of the engagement, made by the person who had been characterized as unwilling to engage. Ali said, "You're serious?" Bruce said, "I'm here." Ali was quiet again. He was thinking, genuinely thinking, which produced in him a different quality of stillness than his performance stillness. His performance stillness was animated underneath. His thinking stillness was actually still. He said, "Show me something, not fighting. I'm not going to fight you in front of 70,000 people on a charity night. Show me something and let me respond." Bruce said, "All right?" He said, "Give me your right hand." Ali held out his right hand, the right hand that had ended more professional boxing matches than any right hand in the history of the sport at that time. Bruce took it, 2 fingers on the inside of Ali's wrist. Light contact, barely pressure, the weight of 2 fingers resting on the surface of the inside of one of the most famous hands in the world. He said, "Rotate your wrist toward me." Ali began to rotate. Bruce's 2 fingers moved with the rotation, maintaining the contact, and at a specific point in the arc applied something so small it barely registered as force, and Ali's rotation continued past where he had intended it to stop, and his elbow followed, and his shoulder followed the elbow. Ali looked at his own arm. He said quietly, "What was that?" Bruce released the wrist. He said, "You committed to the rotation. At the moment of commitment, I redirected it. Your own momentum carried you past where you meant to go." Ali said, "With 2 fingers." Bruce said, "The force was yours. I just gave it a direction." Ali moved his wrist slowly, deliberately, feeling the echo of what had just happened. He said, "Do it again." Bruce said, "Now you know it's coming. It won't work the same way." Ali said, "Try." He extended his wrist. He watched it carefully, looking for whatever Bruce was going to use. Ready to feel the thing and correct for it this time, Bruce touched the wrist at the same point, same 2 fingers, same pressure. Ali's rotation started, and stopped at exactly the right moment. He looked at Bruce. He said, "I stopped it." Bruce said, "Yes." Ali said, "Because I knew it was coming." Bruce said, "Yes." Ali said, "So knowing matters." Bruce said, "Knowing always matters." Ali said, "But you made it work once when I didn't know." Bruce said, "Yes." Ali said, "So the question is whether I'd know in a real situation." Bruce said, "That's always the question." Ali was quiet for a moment. He looked at the crowd. 70,000 people watching a conversation between 2 men, one very large and one not large, that had become something different from what anyone had expected when the evening began. He said, into the microphone so the crowd could hear, "This man just did something to my wrist that I'm still trying to understand." The crowd responded. Ali said, "Let me tell you something about what just happened. I spend my whole career reading people. I watch how they move, I watch their shoulders, I watch their feet, I watch everything before a fight and everything during it. I read people. He looked at Bruce. He said, I cannot read this man. The crowd was very quiet. Ali said, I watched him walk from the 17th row to right here, and I could not find a tell, not one, and I find tells on everybody. My whole career is tells. He said, that is the most unusual thing I have seen in 20 years of looking at people who fight. He turned to Bruce. He said, you said something when you were walking up. You said bigger than you expected. Bruce said, yes. Ali said, explain that. Bruce said, size is one kind of big, there are others. Ali said, like what? Bruce said, like seeing what's coming before it arrives. Like being where the other person expects to find you half a second before you decide to be there, and half a second after you've already left. Ali said, that's speed. Bruce said, it's not speed alone. Speed is part of it. The other part is reading the intention before the action. You don't move after someone moves. You move when you see the decision they're about to make. Ali was quiet, the quiet of genuine reception, something landing and being absorbed. He said, you can read intention. Bruce said, I've been training to read it for 20 years. Ali said, how? Bruce said, the body tells the intention before the action happens. Always. The shoulder before the punch, the hip before the kick, the weight transfer before the shoulder. If you watch what comes before the before, you're never responding. You're already there. Ali moved his right shoulder slightly, instinctively, checking it against what Bruce had said. Bruce watched this and said, your right shoulder, before a right cross. It drops approximately a third of a second before your hip commits to the rotation. Ali's shoulder moved again, involuntarily. He said, my trainers have never told me that. Bruce said, your trainers are inside the work. Sometimes you see things better from outside. Ali looked at him. He said, you watched my fights. Bruce said, several of them. Ali said, and you found that. Bruce said, it's consistent. Every fight. Every round. Ali said, that's a vulnerability. Bruce said, in a specific context, against someone who's looking for it and is fast enough to use it. Against most opponents, it doesn't matter, because most opponents can't read that level. Ali said, but you can. Bruce said, yes. The crowd was completely quiet. 70,000 people, and the specific silence of a very large group that has been in the presence of something it did not anticipate and has not yet decided how to process. Ali looked at Bruce for a long moment. Then he said, into the microphone, I said on the radio that Bruce Lee was afraid to fight. I said it because I believed it. I said it because I had formed an opinion, and I was stating it, and I was not wrong to state what I believed. He paused. He said, I'm standing here now, and I want to say something different. He said, I was measuring a man by a measure that doesn't fit him. I was asking whether he could do what I do in the way I do it, and the answer to that question is no, he cannot. He's not built for that. He's not trained for that. That's not his domain. He said, but that's not the right question. The right question is whether he's built something real, whether what he's developed actually works. Whether the 20 years he put into it produced something genuine. He looked at his own wrist. He said, the answer to that question is yes. He said, I know it's yes, because he stood in front of me and I couldn't read him, and in 20 years of doing this professionally, I have not stood in front of someone I couldn't read. He said, I was wrong in the specific thing I said. He's not afraid to fight. He's not afraid of anything I can see. He came here to correct something I said about him, and he did it in front of 70,000 people, which is not the behavior of a man who's afraid. He looked at Bruce. He said, I said it in front of the world. I'm saying the correction in front of the world. Bruce said nothing for a moment. Then he said, quietly, you didn't have to do that publicly. Ali said, I did it publicly because I did the other thing publicly. Bruce said, that takes something. Ali said, not as much as you think. The hard part was figuring out I was wrong. Once you figure that out, saying it is easier. The crowd's response was the warmest sound of the evening, warmer than anything Ali's boxing had produced, warmer than any moment in the program. The specific sound of a large crowd that has watched something real happen and is expressing genuine recognition of it. Ali extended his right hand. Bruce took it. They shook hands in the center of the floor in front of 70,000 people, and the response that came from the stands was the kind that takes years to explain accurately. They talked for another several minutes in front of the crowd, and for longer after the crowd had been thanked and the evening formally concluded. The conversation that happened on the floor, the part with the microphone and 70,000 witnesses, is the part that circulated and was reported and became part of the record. The conversation that happened after in the corridor off the main floor with 4 people present and no cameras, is the part that the people who were there kept largely to themselves. What was reported, from one of the 4 people present who eventually spoke about it, was that Ali asked Bruce to explain the shoulder tell in more detail. That Bruce walked him through the sequence of his own initiation, from the earliest visible signal forward, showing him what it looked like and when it appeared, and what it communicated about what was coming. Ali had listened with the specific attention he brought to genuine technical information, which was total and patient. He had asked whether the tell could be removed. Bruce had said it was built from years of training in a specific way. Removing it would require rebuilding the initiation of the right cross from an earlier point in the sequence. The cross would be less powerful temporarily while the correction was established. Ali had said, how long temporary? Bruce had said, months before it's meaningfully smaller. Longer before it's reliable. Ali had said, that's time I don't have before the next fight. Bruce had said, you could use it as a decoy instead. Make the tell obvious and use the opponent's reading of it as a setup for something else. Ali had been quiet for a moment, then he had said, you just turned a vulnerability into a weapon. Bruce had said, that's one way to look at it. Ali had said, how do you look at it? Bruce had said, I look at it as information that was already there. I just pointed at it. The conversation had continued from there. How long it lasted and what else was said is known only to the 4 people who were present. One of them said, years later, that it was the most technically detailed conversation she had ever heard between 2 people in 2 completely different disciplines, and that the detail moved in both directions. Ali asked about initiation reading. Bruce asked about what it felt like to be hit hard enough to lose the floor for a moment, and what came back first when it did. Ali said, it was the training that came back first, the body doing what the body had been taught to do before the mind could catch up and tell it to. Bruce said that was the truest thing he had ever heard anyone say about training. Ali said it was just what happened, and he had never thought of it as anything more than that. Bruce said most true things were that way. They just happened, and the thinking about them came later. The radio interview from 4 days before the event was replayed frequently in the weeks after the evening, in the specific way that things get replayed when the context around them has changed, and the replaying is designed to highlight the contrast. Ali was asked about it in his next press appearance, 3 days after the evening. He said, I said something that I believed, and then I found out my belief was based on incomplete information. Once I had more information, I said something different. That's how it's supposed to work. The journalist said, do you regret the original statement? Ali said, I regret that I stated it as a fact when I was working from an assumption. I don't regret having the conversation. The conversation was worth having. The journalist said, what came out of it? Ali said, I found out there's a man in the world I cannot read. That's worth knowing. He paused. He said, and I found out my right shoulder has a tell I didn't know about, which I'm working on. He said this last part, without elaborating on how he'd come to know it, and the journalist did not ask, and the exchange ended there. Bruce was asked about the evening once, in a written interview for a martial arts publication. He said, Muhammad Ali is the most physically serious person I have ever watched perform their craft. What he has built in 20 years of professional fighting is real, in ways that I have thought about carefully, and that I learn from. The interviewer asked if he had been afraid to accept the challenge when he stood up from the 17th row. He said, I wasn't thinking about fear. I was thinking about what the situation required and whether I could provide it. The interviewer asked what it required. He said, honesty. He said something publicly that wasn't accurate. The honest response was to address it where it was said. The interviewer asked why he chose the wrist demonstration rather than any other kind of demonstration. He said, because I wanted him to feel the principle rather than watch it. Watching teaches you what something looks like. Feeling teaches you what it is. He said, he felt it. That's why the conversation after was real. He said everything real starts with someone feeling something instead of just watching it. Subscribe if this story was worth your time. Tell me in the comments what you think Ali was thinking in the moment when he couldn't read Bruce's approach from the 17th row. I read every one.